Next, we have Mr. Nielson. Mr. Nielson, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee. I'm representing the Canadian Urban Transit Association, but my day job is the Director of Enterprise Sustainability at TRANSLink, and I'm responsible for developing and leading the climate action plan and strategy for our organization. TRANSLink is North America's first multimodal transportation authority, enacted by provincial legislation in 1998, and we serve a region of 2.5 million people that's going to grow to 3.5 million people by 2050. This region encompasses 21 municipalities, 9 First Nations, 1 treaty nation, and 1 electoral district. But we're not just about transit. We own and operate 6 bridges in the region, and we provide operations and maintenance funding for the major road network and invest in cycling and walking infrastructure together with our regional partners. Climate change is directly affecting our region. In 2021, as you know, our population was directly affected by significant events that have been directly linked to climate change. During the summer of that year, 619 people died across British Columbia during the successive heat waves and the heat dome. Then later, October, November that year, the region was effectively physically and economically cut off from the rest of Canada due to successive atmospheric rivers and the flooding and the bridge takeouts that ensued. Climate change is also affecting TRANSLink and transit infrastructure. Our work on an adaptation strategy and plan told us that water, essentially flooding, intense rain and sea level rise is going to affect infrastructure, and heat affects people. We know that several of our bus depots, which we use to deploy our fleet in the region, are located on floodplains, some of which are very well protected while others are not, and will become essentially islands, unable to deliver services during a critical flood event along the Fraser River. We also know that heat is affecting our staff. We've had to shorten some shifts, provide temporary cooling and extra PPE, and make accommodations for staff working in facilities that were designed 30 years ago without air conditioning. And we also know that heat is going to affect our customers. Whether they take transit, walk, or bike, it's really important that we keep them comfortable and safe, and ensuring that they continue to choose TRANSLink and transit over taking the automobile. Adaptation is key to managing our long-term risks, physical or financial, to transit. Our government institutions, our financial institutions, our regional partners, and the Government of Canada that serve and fund transit in Canada are expecting us to have mitigation and adaptation plans and the associated disclosure of those risks. We are grateful for federal investments via the Zero Emission Transit Fund to address climate change mitigation through our fleet transitions, but our long-term success in climate change adaptation is dependent upon 3 things. Number 1, close collaboration, proactive planning, and design between climate change adaptation specialists, engineers, architects, emergency management, and preparedness experts, but as well as the building codes, as Mr. Ness mentioned, are really important for planning and designing to higher standards based on the future climate rather than historical norms. Second, we need consistent, reliable funding, primarily for key things: regional cross-infrastructure or cross-jurisdictional protection against severe events. And that is, for example, the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy, which requires collaboration across the entire region. Second, the premium for designing and constructing new infrastructure that can adapt to the changing climate over the typically 50 to 70-year life cycle that we design and build our infrastructure for. I think the Permanent Transit Fund would be an excellent means of delivering the support to enable transit agencies to manage these long-term risks. And finally, programs that keep our customers safe, comfortable, either it's active or passive cooling strategies or tree canopies that continue to make transit, walking, and cycling a preferred choice that's reliable, convenient, and frequent over the automobile. Next, we need to protect and enhance our natural assets that can oftentimes be our best protection against severe events, but also sequester carbon, improve biodiversity, and bring nature back into the suburban or urban landscape. But we need to do this work in a couple of different ways than in the past. One is equity. Our solutions have to be equitable, just, and do no further disadvantage to equity-seeking groups, those with lower incomes, Can't the planting of trees go alongside zero emissions transit in these neighborhoods? And then second, two-eyed seeing. Acknowledging Indigenous and Western knowledge systems both can help us find long-term adaptation solutions that we may otherwise not see or discover on our own. Finally, I'd like to thank the Canadian Urban Transit Association and the BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure for knowledge sharing between us and the other agencies, and we hope that TransLink's leadership in climate change adaptation will help other agencies across Canada. I look forward to the discussions this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nielsen.
I wanted to just, my last 2 minutes to Mr. Nielsen at TransLink. My riding is Port Moody Coquitlam, so obviously very familiar with TransLink and the new infrastructure that came into my community over the last 5 years. I wanted to talk about this reliable funding, this permanent reliable funding that we know the government has promised, but not until 2026. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing, Mr. Nielsen, how important it is to have that funding advanced and to have it right away.
Thank you for the question, and through the chair, I think there's two aspects of funding, and kind of building on Mr. Ness's comments, is that we actually need sort of two streams. One is to learn to understand more about where our risks and our vulnerabilities are. We're currently conducting risk and hazard and vulnerability studies. So that is just to be able to expand our knowledge. And once we know what our risks and vulnerabilities are, then we can actually define what kind of capital changes, or whether we retreat or advance or modify or upgrade infrastructure. So we need that larger pot as well. The first few years, we're learning more about where our risks and vulnerabilities lie, where we need that consistent funding to do those studies. That's really important. But the larger capital will come later. I think the Permanent Transit Fund should hopefully provide even both, right? But in the interim, we need to get started, and we need to understand what our current risk profile is. We've done some very high level work. We generally know where our risks and vulnerabilities lie, but now we need to go to the next level of detail. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zerillo.
Last question is for Mr. Nielsen, TransLink, and I am a TransLink user whenever I'm in Vancouver, so you have a very good system there. But the problem to me, being from rural British Columbia, rural Canada, is we are certainly putting a lot of investments in urban areas, but our rural communities have opportunities as well. For example, we have a fairly good train system, and so we can actually go to electric trains, but it's really hard to get noticed, I guess, when we're focusing so much on urban. So I'm wondering, being from TransLink, Lower Mainland, I understand, how can we make our government, say federal, more aware of the needs in the rural communities as well, where we have distance challenges and weather challenges and that? Thank you.
Excellent question. So through the chair, I think the Lower Mainland, inclusive of the entire Fraser Valley, needs to be looked at as a system, as a watershed, right? If we take a watershed view, what happened in terms of our flooding several years ago could have happened right in the hearts of our urban populations as well. So the importance of the Lower Mainland flood strategy across the entire system, what we do in one part of that overall watershed for diking or improving or taking back orphan dikes or making them seismic resilience, is really, really important.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen.
It can't just be one body doing that. So I think the federal government has a role in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen, and thank you, Mr. Morrison.